fight. We don't have to kill. Everybody in the whole wide world really just needs to chill. No, we don't have to fuss, no.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Just Chill with Oliver George. This is episode 107, and you may be wondering, Oliver, why are you wearing an extra-large women's shirt from the Canadian Museum of Nature? Well, that's because today I get to interview one of my bucket list guests, a bona fide paleontologist. And as for the women's shirt, they were gracious enough to give it to me, and that's all they had, and beggars can't be choosers. But before we get into it, I do want to remind you, if you are watching this on YouTube and you would prefer an audio-only version of this conversation, you can get that on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and other places like that. If you're hearing my voice right now on one of those platforms, though, and you didn't know there was a visual side to this thing, I would implore you to please come over to YouTube and check it out. Even if you plan on remaining an audio-only listener, if you could swing by the YouTube page, hit the subscribe button, leave a comment or a like. All of that helps to get us in good with Lord Algorithm and keep growing this channel. So if it's your first episode, you're just stopping by, or you've been a fan for a long time, thank you very much, because it sincerely does mean a lot to me. Finally, if you want to reach out to me, maybe with a interesting guest idea, some feedback about the show, or just to say hi and let me know that you're watching, you can do that on social media or send me an email at justchillpodcasting@gmail.com. Now, back to the guest sitting across from me. As I mentioned off the top, paleontologist. I really am kind of, my inner child is boiling over here, I think, because like most children, at some point, I wanted to be a paleontologist. But he's actually made a living out of it. So I'm very, very excited to talk to him. More specifically, he's a paleobiologist with a keen interest in horned dinosaurs, dinosaur ecology, and tooth morphology, and so much more. He is an adjunct research professor with the Carleton University, or just Carleton University, not the Carleton University. Well, it is. It's the only one.
If you work there, it's the Carleton
There
University.
you go.
Yeah.
And also a research scientist for the aforementioned Canadian Museum of Nature. I'm very excited to be chatting with him. It's Dr. Jordan Mallon. Mallon?
Well,
I pronounced that right?
Oh, yeah, you nailed it. Yeah,
Perfect.
No problem. Thanks, Oliver. That was a nice intro, if long.
Yeah, it ran a little long. I'm noticing now these glasses, which I've never worn, are starting to fog up already, but it's probably just the nerves. Well, let's get into it. I honestly was telling my dad that I almost don't even want to do the normal, like, how did you get into the field? Because there's so much of your work I want to discuss.
But we can go there. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, we'll jump around a bit. But before we do, I want to know if there's anything you want to plug or promote, maybe any of your work in specific you would love people to check out, or if there's anything at the museum dinosaur related that's coming up.
Oh, boy.
Jeez, I'm just going to take
Nothing dinosaur related on the slate. We just opened a new exhibit for a new insect exhibit at the museum. So
I saw that when I was there today. Yeah,
go check that out. But no, nothing dinosaur related on the docket in the immediate future. If I had to plug something, I don't know. Go check out the dinosaurs at the Canadian Museum of Nature.
There you go.
They never get old, as old as they are.
You've been going there since you were a kid as well?
I have, yeah. I grew up in Ottawa. And so pretty damn lucky to be working where I grew up. And I grew up going to that museum, and it looked quite different back in the day. You know, the dinosaur wing was at the other end of the building, and it was the old gallery that was renovated back in the 70s back then. I don't know if you saw it, but it was a dark looking place. Like,
I mean, I was born in 85, so I spent definitely the early 90s there. Yeah.
The most recent renovation was 2006.
Okay.
So prior to that, the old gallery had like carpeting on the walls and very dim lighting. It was very 70s.
Yeah.
And so that's the museum that I grew up going to. And that was a big influence on me, ultimately, and kind of kept me on the path of being interested in dinosaurs.
So did you, in relation to forming a career around this, did you make a beeline, like knew from the time you were a child, this is what I want to do? Or was it more of a winding road that led you there?
Well, like every kid, from the age of 4, I was interested in dinosaurs, and that never changed. But I was interested in a lot of things. As a kid, I wanted to be a paleontologist. I wanted to be a hockey player. I was a good Canadian boy. I wanted to grow up, and I played hockey as a kid. I wanted to be a comic book artist. I went through a pretty strong comic book phase. Nice. Which is why I like the decor, maybe. Yeah.
And you also have nice teeth, so it's clearly you didn't go into hockey.
I wore a mask.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, what else? I went to the museum growing up. I found my first fossils when I was a kid at the Bonisher Caves, which aren't far from here. I don't
Where
know
is
if you know
that?
where that is.
Didn't you? I think you brought us to some caves when we were younger. Is it on the Quebec side? Or?
Well,
Eganville.
Eganville, those are the
okay.
Bonisher Caves.
Yeah.
So what, an hour and a half from here?
About that,
Almost
yeah.
2
That's
hours.
probably the ones
maybe?
you took us
Yeah,
to.
we went there, and then you go in and they shut the lights off. And
Yeah.
total black.
Yeah.
Yeah, not recommended
Scared the
for the
crap out of
claustrophobic.
Yeah. So that's where I found my first fossils when I was a kid, which was really cool.
And what is that, like trilobites and those types of things?
Trilobites, yeah, crinoids. I think my first fossil was a crinoid ring, which basically just looks like a little Cheerio. It's smaller than that.
But an ancient Cheerio.
An ancient, well, it was mind blowing, because I think, what was it, 520 million years old, they told us. And
Insane.
just ponder the numbers really, wow, really opens your eyes.
It also makes you realize like what a small speck humanity is on the larger history of the Earth.
Yeah, that can work for you and against you in the sense of context. The problem is it's so hard for people to get a sense of what that number means.
Yeah.
We're used to thinking on the orders of years to decades to maybe centuries at most.
At a certain point, it might as well just be a gajillion to a lot of people.
A billion and a million and a trillion is all the same thing.
Yeah.
So in that sense, trying to contextualize deep time can be a bit of a challenge. Which
And
is
that's if
why
you don't have people arguing that it never happened in the first place.
Oh yeah. Although
New Earth creationism is what I'm referring to.
Oh, I get that. Yeah. Which you don't, admittedly, here in Ottawa, at least, it's not something that you hear about a lot.
No, probably more in the Bible Belt.
Oh, certainly. But contextualizing time, even I struggle with it sometimes. We talk so frequently and, dinosaurs died 66 million years ago, but really, how long ago was that? It's hard to you
get a
use
feel,
the term, but it's hard to get a feel.
Yeah. I completely understand that. So was there something else you were maybe getting into school-wise and then you made a shift, or when it went to post-secondary education, that part of your life, were you already pretty set on this?
I was set on it. Like I said, I wanted to be a number of different things growing up, including a paleontologist. But I went and saw Jurassic Park when it came out in theaters when I was 11.
How old? 11. Okay.
I was 11, yeah. It was my dad's gift to my sister and I I graduated grade 5 that year, and he said, well, I'll take you to see a movie. What movie you want to go see? Oh, let's go see Jurassic Park. So I saw that, and I remember coming home that night, and my parents were divorced, so my dad took me out and dropped me off at my mom's place, and I told my mom that night, I said, I'm going to be a paleontologist when I grew up, and literally it was that night that I decided and never looked back. Yeah.
That's so cool. I love when people follow their dreams like that.
Yeah, well, I'm lucky that it worked out for me, I guess. Especially being where I am in Ottawa.
Yeah, close to family and everything.
I count my blessings every day that way. Absolutely, yeah.
It's the National Museum too, as well.
It's the Natural History Museum of Canada. That's right. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's start off before we get into your specific work by just talking about paleontology at large, because I do have some questions there. First of all, when was the birth of the science, so to speak? When did humans start doing this and really recording the data? And was there a godfather of sorts or someone that I read about a guy named Lawrence Lambe who seemed very interesting.
Well, Lawrence Lambe, yeah. So paleontology, people have been finding fossils for as long as people have been around, but paleontology was not really studied as a science per se until maybe 200 years ago. And in fact, we just celebrated the 200th anniversary of the naming of the first dinosaur, Megalosaurus.
Oh, wow.
In the UK, yeah. This was back in January.
So the 1820s is kind of what really kicked everything off.
Yeah,
Good.
exactly. At least as far as dinosaur paleontology is concerned, we had found other fossils that weren't dinosaurs a little prior to that, not very long prior to that.
It does seem like a lot of archaeology was in the 1800s as well, where you hear about
a lot of those
Egyptology and all
natural sciences took off then.
Yeah.
Following the Enlightenment and the establishment of, the scientific method and, sort of the world opened up where we could apply sort of the critical thinking and hypothesis testing to questions of, be it geology or paleontology or what have you.
And people could start sharing their information
Publishing,
with each other.
yeah. Oh, yeah. The invention of the press was a big deal because you could publish your findings and distribute your findings, and your science was no longer niche.
Yeah.
You could distribute your books and your papers and your pamphlets that way. And
I'm sure things still moved much, much slower as far as
yeah,
research.
yeah.
but-
I mean, science still progresses at a glacial pace. The act of doing the science from the beginning of a project to the end of a project, but once it's published, it's instantaneous now. Yeah.
One of the good things about the internet.
One of the good things. Yeah. There's some good and there's some bad.
Yeah, I think we can all agree on that. Well, I also want to know in relation to fossils and the word taphonomy, which my dad and I, neither of us were familiar with that, but that's sort of the study of organic materials sort of transmuting, for lack of a better word, into minerals. And
Yeah, taphonomy is basically the study of what happens to an animal between the time of its death and its entry into the fossil record. Or some would even expand that to include the time of discovery of the fossil. Some more recent, weathering that happens on it and whatnot. Because we can't interpret the fossil record literally. Not everything that's preserved, not everything that we find today is represented in that fossil record. There are certain biases through which an animal must pass, or filters rather. There are certain filters through which an animal must pass to enter the fossil record.
okay.
So a really common example, we more commonly find, at least in terms of dinosaurs, we more commonly find the big dinosaurs compared to the small dinosaurs. And because there are multiple reasons for that. Small dinosaurs, because they're small, it's very easily for them to have been eaten whole. If an animal died and laid on the ground, or a big tyrannosaur came along, if the dinosaur was the length of this table, a tyrannosaur could swallow that in one gulp.
Well, and even the ones that didn't get eaten, they're just that much smaller, physically speaking.
They're that much
the remains.
smaller, yeah. And very often when we find their remains, certainly in North America, they're very often preserved in ancient riverbeds. And those rivers were constantly flowing back, 75 million years ago, and they'd be disturbing the carcass and they'd be washing bones away. And of course, it's easier to wash away a light bone compared to a big, heavy bone.
Yeah.
And so you flush those lighter bones, those smaller bones out of the preservational system, the depositional system, and you're left with the big, what we call lag deposits, the big heavy stuff that doesn't get washed away. So again, there's another example of why it's easier to preserve the big animals versus the small ones.
Wow. And is there an estimate out there as to how many dinosaurs may still be undiscovered?
Oh, there have been very
This is a hard
estimates.
thing to approximate.
Yeah. I mean, thousands. It depends on the study you want to believe, but we one example I like to cite, there are 10,000 species of birds alive today at this very moment. And dinosaurs existed for over hundreds of millions of years, and yet we only know of maybe a little over 1,000 species of non-avian dinosaurs.
Oh,
so
I would have thought it was much more than that. But I guess that
Not
makes
just
sense.
yet,
Yeah, I can't
no.
think of that many.
yeah, and we're finding them all the time. Like if we keep up these rates of discovery, I'm sure we'll be at 2,000 before very long. But in the grand scheme of things, in perspective, we know of very few dinosaurs, given how long they lived for, the fact that they covered the entirety of the Earth.
But that's so exciting for up-and-coming paleontologists, knowing that there's still so much out there.
It gives hope. Yeah.
You might get to name something too.
Precisely. Yeah, exactly. That's what we keep going out for, because we know there's still new things to find out. Not just new dinosaurs, but new things about dinosaurs that we already know about. So many dinosaurs are only known from, a partial limb or a partial skull or something like that. And we keep going out because we want to find more of these animals to understand how they were put together, how they worked, how they lived.
That's so fascinating. I mean, honestly, this whole episode, I think my mind's going to be blown. I want to know, what is the process when you're finding a fossil? Specifically, I heard the word holotypes a lot in researching this, and I wanted to know how that related to fossils. All of this I didn't Google because I wanted you to tell me. I was like, I could probably get to the bottom of this, but
it's all good.
Let's hear it from the pro.
So a holotype, a holotype is a word that we apply not just to fossils, but to really any museum specimen. So when we name a new species, let's say I name a new species of dinosaur and I call it Oliversaurus, okay?
Or Justus Chillis, or
sure,
something like that.
Pick your poison.
Yeah.
I have to apply that name to a fossil. Okay, because I can't just apply it to something that doesn't exist. There has to be a fossil that bears that name. And the fossil that bears that name we call holotype. And that can be true not just of a fossil, but of a stuffed mammal or whatever museum specimen we're talking
Even like a
about.
relic or something, like a man-made item? Or
No, this is specifically for biological
okay,
specimens.
organic stuff. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Plants have their own system. They have holotypes as well, and animals and fossils, and you name it. So yeah, a holotype is basically the first example of its kind. So when I say I found an Oliversaurus, that name is applied specifically to this fossil. And if someone else comes along and they say, oh, I think I found an Oliversaurus, well, then they need to compare to that fossil because that is by definition what an Oliversaurus looks like.
Yeah.
That is the holotype.
It's the OG sample. Yeah.
So going along with that, does it mean that in order for a specimen to be a holotype, it has to be like what you would call a very rich specimen? It's a more intact. It's a well-defined. It can't just be like,
A fragment.
the jawbone.
Well,
Yeah.
it can be, and that's the problem.
You wish it wasn't?
Well, in an ideal world, it wouldn't be that way, but sometimes that's all you have. You have a jawbone. You compare it to everything else out there, and you realize this is really
Distinct
different.
and-
This is
yeah.
distinct. This is something new, and so to be able to refer to it, in our research, we'll give it a name, but it could be that later on someone comes along and finds a few other specimens that are more complete. And although those other skeletons look similar to that one jawbone that you found, they might differ. And so you might realize that, that jawbone's really not that useful in allowing us to discriminate these species. And so what was once the holotype of a new species, we might decide, actually, you know what? That's not very diagnostic.
So that position can be usurped by a better...
Well, it would, yes, that fossil will always remain the holotype of
okay.
species X, but we might decide that species X, the name, is no longer useful. So we just drop it. But if someone else comes along and says, oh, you know what? No one ever noticed this feature on this lousy holotype before. I think this makes the holotype unique from everything else we found. Then we can resurrect the name and say,
wow.
actually, species X was valid after all. That's happened countless times, not just in paleo, but in animal taxonomy generally.
Huh.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, it's a really, it can, naming new fossils and new animals can be a really messy thing that involves a lot of bookkeeping that I don't at all enjoy.
cross-referencing with other files that already exist, I imagine.
Yeah, we have to keep track of catalog numbers and publication dates and things like that in order to sort of fully understand the naming history of certain species and make sense of it all.
Well, when you were finding a fossil, there's two questions I want to ask. First of all, just what the process is like when you discover something. How do you then get that to a museum? I'm sure that's quite the process. But I'm also very, very curious about when you're discovering a new species that's never been seen by human eyes. That's got to be pretty hard to put together if you don't have an example to pull from. How do you even begin? Especially, I guess my question would extend to, do most fossils sort of lie still in one piece, so to speak, where you've got at least an idea of where everything's going to go? Or is it stuff like you were talking about earlier where a river is maybe moving fragments and then you're kind of mixed up a bit?
Well, I mean, dinosaurs come in all types of and variations of completeness and incompleteness. As I said earlier, you can find an animal, just a single jawbone, or you can find an entire articulated skeleton from the end of the snout to the tip of the tail, and
That's
it's all
gotta be a
there.
good day.
Yeah, and it's a very rare day that happens. It depends on, as I say, the taphonomic history of the specimen and the type of environment in which the skeleton was deposited. So I worked on a fossil just recently out of China, It was we can maybe talk about it later. A fighting dinosaur and mammal, and these two animals were preserved together, and they were complete from head to tail. And we think what happened is they were buried in what's called a lahar deposit or a lahar flow, which is basically a reworked volcanic mud deposit that preserved the animals instantaneously, and so you're preserving a snapshot in time, which is a rare occurrence in the fossil record, but it does happen. We do see it on occasion, like this one place in China. And so you get complete articulated skeletons. But elsewhere, if you're preserving a dinosaur in a river-type environment, then the skeletons are going to disarticulate. Maybe the skeleton sat on the shoreline for a little bit on a riverbank, and it was exposed to the elements, and a Tyrannosaur came along and took a leg off it, and Croc came along and took an arm off it or something like that. And eventually the skeleton got reworked into the river channel, which then winnowed away some of the lighter bones. And you're left with an incomplete and disarticulated skeleton. So
Yeah, it must be quite the puzzle in a situation like that. Like, it seems almost like it would be impossible to even get to the bottom of it and put together correctly.
Yeah, and sometimes it's hopeless. Sometimes you got a mix of multiple animals all preserved together, and it's hard to tell which bone goes with which. And is this jumble of bones all one species, or are we got two species mixed in together, two skeletons maybe? And people have named dinosaurs on the basis of sort of a chimeric jumble of bones. That's happened before. One thing that's tricky is I work a lot in, I just completed a big project working in a bone bed of horned dinosaurs, an animal called Centrosaurus. And in bone beds, what these are like mass graveyards, so mass burial grounds of maybe like a herd of dinosaurs. And very often the bones of the individual animals all get jumbled up. So you can't tell which bone goes with which. You have a good idea that it's all the same species, given that all the bones are sort of alike. But it's hard to be able to re-articulate an entire skeleton just based on the fact that all the sort of positional associations of the bone are completely lost. So
yeah.
that makes it a challenge. It's like putting a puzzle together, but you don't have the picture
box.
to work from.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
So it's incredible that so many have actually been built then, if you ask me. I mean, because every dinosaur at one point was an undiscovered one, and unless they're finding one of these rare, complete ones, they're having to do this. So
yeah, and that's been the progression of paleontology for the last 200 years. When we were first finding dinosaurs, we were finding teeth and bits of jaw and isolated vertebrae, and then sort of extrapolating based on our comparisons with what we know about animals today, extrapolating what the animal must have looked like. So I mentioned 200 years since we named Megalosaurus. Megalosaurus we know today was probably something like a T-Rex, very generally speaking, bipedal and smallish arms and a big head full of sharp teeth and, long tail stretching out behind it, held off the ground, like our common picture of T-Rex now. But when they first found it, they had no idea they had a piece of jaw to work from. And they knew based on the teeth that this thing must have been quite reptilian, but they had very little to go beyond that. It's a big reptile, and so they reconstructed it as looking like a big reptile. So it was quadrupedal. It was dragging its tail on the ground, and we couldn't have been more wrong, as it turns out. But
once they found one of those legs, I imagine they said, "Okay."
Yeah, we only find out what the animal looks like upon finding more and more, and we're at the stage now where. It's hard to surprise us now. We know, generally speaking, about most of the various major groups of dinosaurs out there, the various families, tyrannosaurs and hadrosaurs and horned dinosaurs now. And we have a pretty good understanding of how these animals were put together because we've found enough stuff now that we know the basic gestalt of all these different groups. But we're still wrong sometimes.
Well, it sounds like they may still find new ones. I mean, so that's going to be every time a bit of a conundrum.
Yeah, the finding of like a whole new variety of dinosaur happens a little less often now. Like
that makes sense.
We're not discovering entire new families that we didn't know existed, although it does happen occasionally. What we're doing now largely is sort of filling in the gaps, all the different species of tyrannosaurs. We're finding out about those and the species of little dromaeosaur type dinosaurs. And
I would imagine it's probably more difficult to find water-dwelling dinosaur remains? Especially, there's got to be some stuff at the bottom of the ocean that no one's ever seen.
Yeah. Well, oh yeah. And I'll chastise you. I'll chide you because you can't say water dinosaurs because technically those marine reptiles were not dinosaurs.
Oh, interesting.
But I know what you mean when you say it.
Isn't that the same about like pterodons and stuff and
Pteranodons,
pterodactyls
technically,
and-
yeah. Pterosaurs, not dinosaurs either. They lived with the dinosaurs. They were friends with the dinosaurs, so to speak, but they were not themselves dinosaurs. People have a tendency to think if it's a fossil and has a skeleton, then it's a dinosaur. Sometimes even if it's not a fossil, people will think it's dinosaur. I've been at the museum before, and people have been looking at. We've got a big blue whale skeleton on display
yes, I've
there.
seen that. It's amazing.
People, especially kids, will come in and go, "Wow, look at the dinosaur! It's big and it's got a skeleton, so it must be a dinosaur," which is not the case. Ditto. I've seen people do the same thing with cow skeletons. Oh, it's a skeleton; it must be a dinosaur. Well, no.
Not really, but you can think that if you'd like. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought I heard somewhere that all pterodactyls are pterosaurs, but not all pterosaurs are pterodactyls, or perhaps I have that backwards.
Pterodactylus is a genus name, kind of like Homo is our genus name. And Tyrannosaurus is the genus name of the species we call T-Rex. So Pterodactylus or pterodactyl commonly is a genus name of a very specific type of pterosaur.
Okay.
So all pterodactyls are pterosaurs, but not all pterosaurs are pterodactyls.
Okay, that's what it was. I had heard that on a podcast somewhere.
Yeah, it's like saying all humans are mammals, but not all mammals are humans, right?
Yeah, that's very true.
That's
Most
just the
aren't.
nature of sort of the systematic hierarchy or the branching tree of life. You can go out on further branches and further twigs on those branches, and you get more specific as you go out further on the branch, but you never really outgrow your ancestry. So we're primates, but we're also mammals and we're also vertebrates.
Yeah.
Right. We might evolve one day to lose our spine. I don't know.
We're also carbon-based life forms.
Yeah,
if you want to
yeah.
go that far out. Yeah.
But we'll never stop being a vertebrate, even if we lose our backbone. We came from vertebrates, therefore we remain vertebrates, and we might lose our vertebrae secondarily in some wild evolutionary scenario.
Weird.
But we'll always remain vertebrates. You're always nested within your family. It's kind of like,
Interesting.
I like to reference because everyone knows file structures on computers. You click a file and then you go inside that file and there's 3 more files and you click through.
Yeah.
And you're the sort of heritage of that file structure is preserved on your computer is almost like an address. You can copy it, C drive : / this file, and go deeper into the nested structure. And that's basically how the evolution of life works.
It's a lot to take in. Wow, it's super, super fascinating. I saw you in something that you had written talking about the importance of relocating quarries and previous dig sites because I guess 50 plus years ago, people just mainly wanted the skeleton for display purposes and they overlooked a bunch of data that we would now consider very valuable. So I'm wondering, when did that start to change in the field of paleontology where people said, hey, we need to go back and do a second take on some of these spots?
Yeah. Well, the sort of quarry relocation project that I referred to in that article really has its history, I guess, with a guy by the name of Charlie Sternberg. So Charlie Sternberg worked for the Geological Survey of Canada, whose museum eventually became the Canadian Museum of Nature, where I'm at. And Charlie was one of the most prolific collectors of dinosaurs in the world, and certainly in Canada.
When would this have been?
Oh, this would have been the turn of the last century. He worked for our museum between 1912 through to his retirement in 1950.
Oh, wow.
And actually, in those earliest years, he was working with his dad and his 2 brothers collecting dinosaurs for the museum. And
Maybe
they
working
eventually,
with Lawrence Lambe, even.
Actually, they did.
I saw he passed away in 1919 and here in Ottawa.
Yeah, Lawrence Lambe was Canada's first vertebrate paleontologist, the first paleontologist to work on non-shelly things, effectively. Yeah, and he hired the Sternberg family, which included a dad and 3 sons, to come up from Kansas to collect fossils on behalf of Canada to populate Canada's Natural History Museum with these fossils that we were just learning were available out in Alberta.
Wow.
And where was I going with this now? Talking about Charlie Sternberg and...
Yeah, sorry, I threw Lawrence back in there.
Yeah.
Threw you for a loop maybe, but...
Yeah. Well, Charlie, yeah, no.
We're talking about revisiting
the
sites,
Quarry project.
and when did
Thank
that
you.
become pertinent to
Yeah. Well, so Charlie spent, decades of his life collecting dinosaurs. And back then the philosophy was we're going to collect this stuff to populate our museums and draw in crowds, basically. And I don't want to say science be damned, but that was not
Financially motivated, though. To some
in
degree,
a sense. Yeah. The primary goal wasn't the science per se, although they did get a lot of science out of it, but they weren't interested. They were just interested in basically stamp collecting, putting names on species, but not as much interested in, as I say, the sedimentological context, the rocks in which we find this thing. This is all data that the paleontologists today thrive on, but that they weren't interested in back then. They had other things that drove them. But knowing where these animals came from in the rock record is really important. If you're talking about, animal evolution, you want to know which ones came first and which ones came later. You want to know something about, if you want to reconstruct what we talked about earlier, the taphonomic history of the specimen, you got to know what kind of sediments it was deposited in. You want to know if it was an articulated or a disarticulated animal. I've done some work looking at the preservation of these armored dinosaurs, ankylosaurs, and I want to know if...
That's how you say it? I've always said ankylosaur.
Tomato.
Oh, okay.
You want to know if they're preserved upside down or not. We can get into that later, but this is all data that the Sternbergs weren't collecting back in the day. And so Charlie Sternberg, this is back in 1936, sort of realized it'd be really good to go back and actually map these sites where we found them so people in the future can
With
find
future
where these
technologies and
find where this dinosaur came from in the rocks. And so he started that project in 1936 and ultimately published a map in 1950 in Dinosaur Provincial Park, showing where all these different fossils were found. But of course, he couldn't remember where all the fossils he had collected had come from. And, some of the specimens that he collected have question marks on them. And
But it's a ballpark, at least, in a lot of instances.
Yeah. And so there have been various paleontologists in Canada, Phil Curry and Darren Tankey, who have who've spent a good amount of their careers trying to relocate some of these lost quarries. And Darren in particular has done an amazing job of doing sort of the detective work of lining up old field photographs and looking at how the shadow is cast to know which way the camera was facing when the picture was taken, and you can line up the horizon in the background.
Wow, that's some sleuth work there.
Yeah, look for old quarry trash, old bits of plaster that they used to wrap their dinosaur bones in. And in so doing, he was able to relocate a lot of these old finds and give us those data that we thought we had lost. And so that's something that I've been involved with a little bit too. I've been out with Darren before, and I've been out on my own trying to relocate Triceratops quarries in southern Alberta. That
sounds like a lot of fun.
Actually.
Yeah, I was gonna say, that sounds awesome.
Well, when you find something, it's really cool because if you're trying to find one of these lost quarries, a dinosaur was collected around here, 100 years ago based on the old field notes that I'm working from. But if you're looking to find something like that, you want to find, good evidence that there was someone there collecting a dinosaur. And as I said, old bits of plaster that they used to wrap the dinosaurs in is really useful to be able to do this kind of detective work, or old bits of lumber that they'd use to build the crates into which they put the bones. Stuff like that really lets you know. Paleontologists back then would just leave their trash all over the place. They weren't so good at hauling their trash out, which is actually sound kind of bad today, but it's actually beneficial to us as paleontologists.
It's like breadcrumbs for you.
Exactly like that. Yeah.
Huh. That is super. And is finding new sites today becoming a little bit easier with stuff like LiDAR and other technologies that can sort of penetrate the earth and get a good fix on where things might be?
You would think so, but no. No, there's no better way to find a fossil than to get out with your boots on the ground and get your nose up to the dirt and, look for, bone weathering out of the ground. You're seeing more and more drone technology used today, but we're not using the drones so much to look for fossils over the landscape because, when the drone's 20 feet up in the air, it's hard to see much detail on the ground. We're using drones more for mapping the landscape, but
to say we've been here, let's keep moving.
yeah, or you can create like a 3D topology of the Badlands, and then you can overlay your GPS data of where you found things, and you can put it in a sort of a 3-dimensional context.
That's got to be incredibly useful.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It gives you an idea not just of where in latitude and longitude these things come from, but where in the rock record they come from too. So you've got this 3-dimensional map over space and time, as it were. And it's, doing that kind of mapping is very useful. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah.
I also wanted to touch on microsites, which was a term I saw that you were referring to, and you were doing a lot of this during the pandemic, stuck at home.
Oh yeah, I
If
know
you could
the
just
blog
explain
post.
a little bit about microsites and what their value is and what you do with them.
Yeah. So most people, when we think about collecting dinosaur bones, we think about, collecting a whole skeleton, ideally. And that's what we often see in museums. Microsites don't make for great museum displays, but they are very important scientifically. So what a microsite is, it's basically an accumulation of small, micro-sized fossils that are, I don't know, they vary in size, but on average, maybe the size of your fingernail.
Oh,
and this might include small teeth. It might include, small claws from dinosaurs,
vertebrae,
or fish vertebrae, or gar scales, fish scales, things of this nature. And they accumulate, on sandbars or something like that back in the Cretaceous period. And as these rivers are making their way down, they're depositing fossils on sandbars, and you get these accumulation of what's just basically suspended debris in the river system. But it's a great way of getting an understanding of the diversity of animals that lived in the environment at the time. Because if you find a fossil,
right?
Yeah, if you find a fossil, you have one example of one individual, which is great, but it tells you nothing about what was living in the environment at the time beyond this one individual. Whereas a microsite is this a big accumulation, you have thousands and thousands of little bones that can tell you about all the different animals, not just the big dinosaurs, but the little ones and the crocodiles and the frogs and the snakes and the lizards and you name it. They're all represented. Especially if you've got a really rich, productive microsite, they're all represented in there. So they're really important to study in order to give us, again, an understanding of the biodiversity that lived at the time.
And some of the interactions taking place, I would imagine, too.
Well, yeah, they don't give you an idea per se of how the animals interacted. Take a really incredible fossil to preserve that, but they at least give you an idea of what kind of carnivores were around, what kind of herbivores were around, what...
And you can
what was available
infer
to
some
be
things
eaten.
from that. You mean, like, if these two were living at the same time, maybe this guy ate this guy, like that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And they give you an understanding too of the depositional system. If you've got a lot of aquatic animals in your microsite, then you know that there was a lot of water around to support all those pond turtles and crocodiles and whatnot. And if you've got a microsite that's we might say depauperate in those animals, so not many examples of those aquatic life forms, then you know you're preserving a depositional environment that's maybe there's not much standing water around. You're away from those sort of water-rich systems. So they give us an understanding of the animals that were around at the time, but also a general feel for the types of environments that are around too.
I'm really happy you mentioned water systems, because that's a perfect segue into some of your work, which I feel like we should explain. Well, we should explain to my audience something that was brand new to me last night, which was Laramidia, Appalachia, and the Western Interior Seaway, which is basically the middle of North America used to be water, and there was 2 giant islands, is what I gather. And a lot of your work pertains to Laramidia, which sounds like an STI. I just gotta say. Oh, he caught Laramidia.
You know what? I never thought about that.
Yeah, anything that ends in media, I'm thinking, ew.
I'll have to use that sometime.
There you go. Yeah, it's yours. Take it.
Probably get kicked out of a conference or something.
It'll be worth it.
Yeah. So this is a certain seaway. This involves the Western Interior Seaway that formed at the end of the Cretaceous period. I think going back, I think it first appears 100 million years ago, and then lasts up until the end of the age of the dinosaurs. And the Western Interior Seaway was a shallow inland sea that basically flooded North America north-south from the Arctic Ocean down to the Gulf of Mexico. And that effectively divided North America into a western landmass, as you say, we call Laramidia, and an eastern landmass.
And the western was sort of the Rocky Mountains, I would imagine. We're on the east side of that.
Bingo, yeah. And the eastern landmass we call Appalachia. But most of our really good, rich fossil record comes from the Laramidian side. You know, that's where we find all the classic dinosaurs that we know of from places like Dinosaur Park, and further south in Montana, T-Rex and all those things, Triceratops. Those were all living on Laramidia.
All the coolest dinos.
Yeah, you know, being in Ottawa here, we were on Appalachia, and there were certainly dinosaurs over here, but for various reasons, the fossil record of that time period is much poorer. So we have a much poorer understanding of the dinosaurs that were around then. Yeah.
Well, pertaining to all that, you were trying to prove the niche partitioning theory.
Oh, you're going deep.
Oh, yeah, because I thought this stuff was really interesting. There was all these herbivores that were coexisting on Laramidia, which is a big chunk of land, but considering the biomass of these creatures and how many of them there were and how much food they would have needed to eat, people have been wondering, well, how did they all survive on this shared domain? And the niche partitioning was the explanation, which it sounds like checks out. Based on your studies.
Yeah, so this is my PhD research that you're talking about, which you've framed the question quite well. So we know if we go to Dinosaur Park today in Alberta near Brooks, the town of Brooks, and we look in the rock record there, we might see that at any one horizon, at any one instance of time in the rock record, you might find like 4, 5, 6, probably 6 to 8 species of really large dinosaur. Jeez. You know, you've got typically 2 species of horned dinosaurs running around at the time. You get typically 2 species of duck-billed dinosaurs, these hadrosaurs. And you get 2 species of the ankylosaurs, the big armored dinosaurs.
Duck-billed, I went instantly Land Before Time in my head.
Oh, yeah. So you get all these different species living together. They're big-bodied species, like multi-tons, and the only place you see anything like that today is the African savanna. But even then, if you go to the African savanna today, you're only going to see maybe 4 species of big-bodied animal. You might see a rhino and a giraffe and a hippo and an elephant.
Yeah.
You know? But you've got sometimes double that. The number of species in the dinosaur times. And as I say, they're living on a relatively narrow strip of land, Western North America. So the question is, like, how do you support so many large species of big-bodied animals? These things presumably needed to eat a lot to sustain themselves. How do you support so many species in an environment like that? And there are 2 ways you might do that. One is that maybe food was not limiting. Maybe these animals, the carbon dioxide in the environment was higher at the time, and maybe that meant more productivity. So maybe there was just a lot of plant food around.
And we knew there was megaflora back then too, like a lot of the plants were much
absolutely.
larger.
Well, not necessarily much larger than today, but during the Cretaceous period, especially towards the end, plant life was fairly similar, I want to say, to plants today. They had a lot of similarities between Cretaceous plants, especially late Cretaceous plants, and those today. But it might be that just plant food was more abundant, and so there was lots of food to go around. Dinosaurs didn't need to share, and so you can support a lot of different species on that big pie, so to speak. Or the other option is maybe dinosaurs didn't need to share food because they just weren't very hungry. They had slow metabolisms and they didn't require a lot of food, which meant that there was lots for everyone to eat, and you could sustain many species that way.
Seems hard to imagine an animal that large being able to, survive on minimal amounts of food.
I agree.
Yeah, okay,
it's a relative thing, though.
Okay.
So that's this idea that food isn't limiting. The other idea is that food is limiting, and that dinosaurs, as you mentioned earlier, need to practice what we call niche partitioning, which is to say that all the different species had to avoid competing with one another by focusing and eating different plants.
So like I'm just going to eat
Yeah,
the
you stick
bamboo
to
or
your
whatever,
diet and I'll stick to mine, and we don't have to compete because, of course, there's an ancient, ecological piece of knowledge, Gauss's competitive exclusion principle, which says that no two species can coexist indefinitely on the same limited resource. One has to eventually outcompete the other. And that other losing species either goes extinct or moves off to another area or whatnot.
or figures out how to digest something else.
Or they figure out how to divvy up the pie, and you focus on these
Oh,
plants.
I simply
and I'll
meant
focus on
trying
those.
new plants that maybe, like, let's say these two species are exclusively eating the same thing, and one of them outmans the other or outmuscles the other. Then maybe that other one would be more tempted to say, "Well, I've never eaten these berries before, but I'm gonna give it a shot."
And
hope I
over
don't
the
die."
long run, over evolutionary time, they would come to specialize on that new food source and thereby avoid going extinct.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the idea. So this was kind of setting up my PhD thesis. And so what I wanted to know was, well, if this idea that food is limiting is true, and if these different dinosaurs were specializing on different plants and plant parts, then we should see that reflected in how they're built. We call the concept of ecomorphology. So eco referring to the ecology of an animal, what an animal eats, and morphology referring to the anatomy, the shape of the animal. And we know today that how an animal interacts with its environment, the foods that it eats, is often reflected in the strength of the jaws and the size of the muscle insertion on the skull and things of this nature.
The dental morphology.
The shapes of the teeth. Yeah. Animals today that eat a lot of grass, they ingest a lot of grit. And so they have very tall crowns on their teeth because that way they can, they're not wearing too quickly through their tooth enamel. They've got lots of tooth enamel to spare, so the grit's not a concern to them. So you can sort of take some of these principles and retrodict them onto the fossil record to try and come up with some idea of what these animals were eating and whether or not they were actually specializing on different foods. So long story short, that's what my PhD work showed, was that these different animals, these different big-bodied herbivorous dinosaurs, were probably feeding on different types of food so that they could coexist.
Well, this brings me to another thing, because before he got here, I was telling my dad something that I had stumbled on that I thought was really cool, which was dental batteries, which, again, he didn't know what that was either. My dad knows a lot of stuff about biology, so I'm happy to see where I'm stumping him, and he's learning some stuff today. But this is like teeth that will replace themselves, sort of like a shark. But what I read that I found really interesting was that shark will lose those teeth, whereas these herbivore dinosaurs were reabsorbing them into the process of making new teeth. Am I getting that right?
You're getting close. It's definitely not like dentures made out of batteries, as most people.
No, I didn't mean that. I thought battery meant like renewable.
Effectively, yeah. Battery just refers to the act of stacking the teeth. So the two probably best known examples of dinosaurs with dental batteries would be the horned dinosaurs, ceratopsian dinosaurs like Triceratops.
Or Styracosaurus.
That
was always one of my favorites.
Yeah, we got the holotype of that in Ottawa here.
Oh, crazy.
Yeah. And the duck-billed dinosaurs, hadrosaurs. So both of these groups had very specialized jaws in each jaw there were hundreds of teeth packed close together, and the teeth almost functioned as one unit, as like one big tooth.
Weird.
And in horned dinosaurs and the ceratopsians, the dental batteries produce one long shearing plane. So their teeth work basically like a set of scissors.
Oh.
All together as one big pair of scissors, sort of shearing and slicing plant food that way. Whereas hadrosaurs, their teeth had a subtly different shape to them, and the the cutting surface wasn't just vertical as it is in the horned dinosaur, but there was some component of horizontal component too. So they were probably capable of some amount of shearing and crushing too, which tells you that they're likely specializing on different types of plants as a result. They've got those different sort of dual functionality in the duck-billed dinosaurs.
Wow. And were there any teeth in other types of dinosaurs that were more for pulverizing food, like really blunt sort of?
Not really. You don't see, like a good example of something what we might call like a grinding pavement in vertebrates today. You see that sometimes in like, stingrays, for example, fishes that are using their that grinding pavement to grind up like shells and whatnot.
Yeah.
And that's not something that we see very commonly in dinosaurs. Usually you see the shearing, the combination, as I say, shearing, grinding in the hadrosaurs. Most, I think it's fair to say most, or at least certainly many small plant-eating dinosaurs had very simple, what we call filiform teeth, which is to say they're leaf-shaped. Think of something like the teeth of an iguana, and maybe that's hard for your listeners to think of because not many people have seen iguana teeth, but they also
iguana teeth. You probably find a weird punk band from California or something.
Very likely, yeah. But they had leaf-shaped teeth as well, and of course iguanas largely eat mostly plants. So we think dinosaurs that had similar types of teeth ate similar types of plants.
And do we know if, I know that there's several mammals that are plant eaters that have like multiple stomachs, like cows, and I guess it's harder to determine.
Ruminants. The ruminants, they've got the forestomach that allows them to, they eat their food, it goes into the forestomach and gets digested a bit, then they spit it back up and chew the cud.
Yeah. Is there any evidence of anything similar to that?
There's no evidence for that in the dinosaur, no.
Okay.
As far as we know, that type of rumination system is unique to mammals, and dinosaurs were very likely hind gut fermenters, as we call them. Now, we don't know that for certain, but that's sort of our base assumption. And until we find like some mind-boggling, spectacular fossil that says otherwise, it's
got to be hard to hypothesize about like organic tissue and muscles and organs and stuff when you're dealing with strictly bones.
It can be. Sometimes you get lucky, especially with the muscles, because the muscles attach to the bones in order to, move them. And so when muscle attaches to bone, it leaves a small scar very often, or maybe a little process that comes off the bone where the muscle attaches to. And so you can see those scars on dinosaur bones, and then there must have been a muscle that attached here. And you can get some idea as to how the skeleton worked that way. But certainly for a lot of the other soft tissues, the guts and whatnot, we don't really have very good evidence for that. We don't know a whole lot about dinosaur hearts and dinosaur
I find
livers.
it kind of heartbreaking, to be honest, that there's no dinosaurs lost up in the permafrost or anything like that we could get some sort of a tissue sample,
Yeah, no, so do I.
Yeah, I guess it's impossible with them being like cold-blooded, or were they? Because now there's the whole bird angle, which is sort of a newer development in the last few decades, I want to say.
Yeah, no, dinosaurs, were they cold-blooded? Well, it's hard to say because when we're talking about dinosaurs, we're not just talking about one species. We're talking about a whole gamut of animals. It's like talking about mammals. Some mammals are big, some mammals are small, some mammals have lots of hair, some have very little hair. And dinosaurs were probably the same. And mammals vary in their metabolism too. Some have very fast metabolism, some have very, very slow metabolisms, like the monotremes, like the duck-billed platypus.
But would you wager that there's likely never been an Arctic dinosaur or anything that could have ended up in the ice?
Well, if I did wager there was never an Arctic dinosaur, I'd be wrong, because we found them in the Arctic. But
it may not have been cold at that. Yeah.
There were no like polar ice caps at the time. So we know they lived up there, but it was certainly warmer at the time.
There was absolutely no like cold place at that time on Earth, or
no, I wouldn't say that. Dinosaurs probably saw snow on occasion, but they lived in what we call a hothouse world, which is to say average global temperatures were much higher than they are today. We live in a ice house world, we would call it.
Plus, up there wasn't necessarily up there, right? With continental drift and things like that. I mean,
yeah, but you can account for that. So we do know that there were dinosaurs living up near the North Pole.
I was going to ask Antarctica more specifically.
We found them there too.
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
Yeah. But again, it was
Savage Land.
It was
nerd reference there.
It was much warmer at the time, and so certainly they would have seen snow maybe on occasion, but we're not talking about lasting snow that stayed on the ground year round.
Yeah, they're not scraping off their cars or anything.
Yeah, in fact, the dinosaurs that we find in places like the North Slope of Alaska, which at the time was, in the Cretaceous period, was located quite high up north in the Arctic Circle. Even though we find dinosaurs there, we know that they lived there year round because we don't find the remains of those species further south. So they lived there year round. So conditions couldn't have been so bad up there that they were migrating out during the winter or something like that.
Wow. Did you get the Savage Land reference or no?
No, I'm ashamed to say I didn't.
So it's from the X-Men. There was a sort of a hidden world, like a hot spring type thing in Antarctica where there's all these dinosaurs that are still alive and just kind of like a mystical place. You knew what I'm talking about, yeah. I'm a nerd. I'm outing myself as if we didn't already know.
X-Men was my favorite too, but I don't think I was probably too much in the dinosaurs at that point.
Yeah, Kazar was the dude there who was sort of like a Tarzan-like figure.
Kazar, yeah.
And he had a saber-toothed tiger named Zabu, or a Smilodon. So.
My favorite X-Men enemies were do you remember the Brood?
Yeah.
Yeah, those guys were awesome.
They're very reminiscent of like Alien, like xenomorphs.
Yeah, I think that's probably why I liked them so much.
Yeah.
I liked Alien as a kid too.
Oh, my brother's obsessed. My dad can attest to that. My brother loves Alien and Predator and all that.
Who doesn't?
Well, yeah, I mean, I like them as well, but he was really into it. Still is. We were talking about fossils and tissue, and this leads me to another thing that you studied and worked on, which is dinosaur cheeks, which I found was kind of an interesting thing I had never thought of before. And people seemed to be arguing whether or not they had them. And then there was a well-preserved skull of Panoplosaurus mirus.
Nailed it. Yeah.
That ended the debate, so to speak, or...
Yeah. So Panoplosaurus, just to come full circle, was named by Lawrence Lambe.
Oh, there we go. Cool.
Earlier. Yeah.
Buried at Beechwood Cemetery.
Yeah, I've been to the grave, yeah.
I saw a picture of it. I don't know if I'll go in person.
It's probably my picture. What was I going to say? So Panoplosaurus. So as I said, we mentioned earlier that we don't often preserve the soft tissue in the fossil record. And so one of the questions that's come up over the years is, did dinosaurs have cheeks? And how would you know,
As opposed to what? Just like a gaping hole?
As opposed to just a gaping maw like a bird. Birds don't have cheeks,
oh, okay,
right?
fair.
Or crocodiles don't have cheeks either.
Yeah, that's a much better example than what I was picturing in my head.
And you'd think this would this is an issue too if you're trying to reconstruct how these animals worked and fed and whatnot. If you're thinking about a duck-billed dinosaur that's got these tooth batteries and they're trying to chew their food, but they've got no cheeks to hold the food in. How does that work? Yeah. The food's just falling out of the side of their face. So, we had some sort of a priori reason to think that maybe these dinosaurs, or at least some groups, had cheeks and maybe others didn't. Who knows? But you mentioned Panoplosaurus. So Panoplosaurus, we have the holotype skull in Ottawa at the museum. And what's so neat, it's an example of one of these armored dinosaurs, the ankylosaurs, with the clubs typically on the ends of their tails.
Really.
Panoplosaurus did not have the club tail. But
dangerous looking guys, though.
Yeah, it belongs to that group. Heavily armored. And what's interesting, like Panoplosaurus is so heavily armored that it even has bone plates on its cheeks. And although the cheeks have eroded away, the bone plates are still there. So they must have been embedded in some kind of tissue to hold them in place.
Yeah, not just floating there.
Yeah, because what's holding them in place now, of course, is just the rock and the sediment that in which the animal was buried. So the skin is long eroded away, but the cheek plates remain there. And so we know that they must have been embedded within soft tissue skin of some type in order for those to have served a function. Yeah, and so that's some research that my student Marissa Livius just recently worked on for her master's thesis. Was we took the skull, we put it through a CT scanner at a hospital, and she looked at sort of the internal anatomy and how the skull was put together. And that's one of the aspects she looked at was the anatomy of the cheek.
Wow, that also seems really cool.
If I can, just I'd like to know a little more about the fossilization process, which I think all of you mentioned at the top, but I think we kind of got off topic a little bit on that. And I just want to understand better for myself, I guess. And that is, when we talk about finding dinosaur bones, are we finding a remineralized construct of that bone in which the original bone, like the soft tissues, has slowly been replaced by other minerals? Or is
Deposits,
it like hydroxyapatite like our bones are made out of, and the bones just stayed like that all these millions of years?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. It's not the same as the original bone. Like if you pick up a dinosaur bone and you pick up say a cow bone that are equal in size, you'll certainly notice that the dinosaur bone's a lot heavier. It weighs
I
about.
thought you were going to say lighter.
A dinosaur bone, definitely not, because all the original organic material has long ago rotted away and been replaced by mineral, and so it's really effectively one big rock. So yeah, all the original organic remains, and there's been some work that's been done in recent years that pushes back against some of these ideas now, but certainly the majority of the original organic remains are gone and been replaced with mineral. These bones get buried in the ground. There's water percolating through the groundwater. That water is carrying minerals in it, and those minerals, get into all the pores in the bone and eventually get deposited there and replace wherever there were organic remains that rotted away, they're replaced by mineral. That's called permineralization.
So if you were to cross-section a dinosaur bone, would you find like a marrow canal and, the spongy tissue with lots of open spaces and things, or would it just be solid mineral?
It depends, because sometimes not all of those empty spaces have been completely mineralized, in which case you're left with an empty space. But very often, those spaces will have been completely infilled with mineral. It varies. Some bones are more permineralized than others. So it depends on so many factors relating to the depositional environment where the fossil was buried.
So it limits the paleontologist's ability to truly interpret the inner anatomical structure of the bones with any degree of certainty if they don't know how much of it has been preserved as anatomically correct.
Well, yes and no, but very often, although the how might I phrase this? Although the mineral content has changed per se, the structure still remains. And so you can cut open a dinosaur bone and it still looks very similar to what it might have looked like, 75 million years ago, in that you can still see things like growth rings, and you can see the inner trabecular bone, the spongy bone on the inside. Like all that is preserved with high fidelity, even though it might not be the exact same chemical makeup that it was. But that the physical structure very much remains intact, where you can see, the little holes where the bone cells lived. Or
they've found some, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is partially how they started leaning towards the bird connection, is they found evidence of feathers in some fossils, or where the feathers might have grown from.
Yeah, well, feathers themselves, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Or at least their impressions in or like even carbonaceous imprints especially in the dinosaurs that are coming out of China. So the first,
because sorry to cut you off, but this is something I've been thinking about a lot, because I feel like when I was growing up and when Jurassic Park came out, Alan Grant seemed like a fringe theorist with his bird thing that he does for the kid at the beginning, but now it seems pretty common, mainstream accepted.
Yeah, well, he was kind of pitched as being fringe, but really his opinions at the time weren't so crazy.
Oh,
but they were not commonly known in the public, and so I think that's
the
why
layman like myself. Yeah.
So yeah, we've thought really since the first dinosaurs we found, we had some inkling that they might be related to birds, and other paleontologists felt otherwise, and there was a bit of a battle there. But a lot of that sort of debate was put to bed in the 90s when we started finding the first non-avian dinosaurs with feathers, so non-bird dinosaurs with feathers in China.
Or anything.
Yeah, that was 1996 Sinosauropteryx out of China, where we had this beautiful articulated skeleton. It's maybe that big, something like that. And you can see it's a pancake dinosaur. It's preserved on a flat slab of rock, but you can see a sort of halo of feather impressions around it. And that put the debate to bed when we first started finding these feathered but not bird dinosaurs.
Well, I went down a Wikipedia rabbit hole and it was showing a picture of a crocodile and there was some sort of bird in front of it and saying they were both part of like the Archosaurs or some sort of larger family, that they're the most direct relatives to that grouping.
Right. So the Archosaurs are the group of on the tree of life that includes birds and crocodiles. Birds and crocodiles are quite closely related, certainly more than crocs are related to other reptiles. So birds and crocs share a common ancestor to the exclusion of all the other types of reptiles.
Komodo dragons and whatever else.
Bingo. Yeah.
Okay.
And so within that group, within that branch on the tree of life, the dinosaurs are nested. So birds and dinosaurs share a common ancestor to the exclusion of crocodiles. But the crocs and the birds, as we say, we call them archosaurs. And dinosaurs are part of that Archosaurian lineage as well. Yeah.
And they couldn't look more different when you see a picture of a crocodile and a bird. You're not thinking, oh yeah, these guys must be related.
Yeah. But what's interesting is, if you trace their ancestry back far enough through the fossil record, they start to look more and more alike. The earliest birds.
Folders.
Yeah. If you go back in your desktop folder system, the earliest bird, had teeth like a dinosaur, and it had a long tail like a dinosaur, and it had 3 fingers like a dinosaur. No bird like that is around is like that today.
Yeah.
So where does Archaeopteryx fall on that line?
I always loved that one growing up too. Cool name.
Well, Archaeopteryx is an example, one of the oldest examples we have of a fossil bird. So it's not a dinosaur. It is a dinosaur because all birds are dinosaurs. Again, getting back to this idea that you can't outgrow your heritage. Birds are descended from dinosaurs. Therefore, by definition, they are dinosaurs. So Archaeopteryx is a dinosaur, but it's also a bird.
More like in line with what we would consider a bird.
It's closer to today's living birds than any other dinosaur was living. Like it's closer to birds than T-Rex and Velociraptor and Stegosaurus and you name it. Yeah.
So if we can find evidence of feathers, which we have, I would imagine there's still no concrete evidence to suggest what color like a dinosaur's skin would have been. That's all kind of just artists rendering.
Generally speaking, yes.
They might have been hot pink or something.
They could have been, yeah. But even that story is changing. So what you said, you were born in 85?
Yes.
I was born in 82.
I figured we were close.
So when we were growing up.
Although I got more grays than you by a mile. Jesus.
I take after my dad.
There you go.
When we were growing up, we would have read in the textbooks that we'll never know what color dinosaurs were because the color doesn't preserve. And that's true. Actually, if you went to the Canadian Museum of Nature in the old fossil gallery, they had an old touch screen computer and you could put you could put colors on this digital dinosaur and you could put plaid on it and polka dots. And the lesson was you can put anything you want on this dinosaur because we'll never know. But that's changed in recent years, maybe the last decade or so. Again, particularly with respect to these Chinese feathered dinosaurs, because as it turns out, bird feathers today, they get much of their color, not all of their color, but they get much of their color from pigments. And there are little organelles within the cells, melanosomes they're called. I almost lost it.
Yeah, I wasn't going to be able to help you out on that one.
Melanosomes are these little organelles that create the pigments. And what's interesting is in bird feathers, the shape of the melanosome corresponds to the color that it produces, the color of the pigment that it produces.
And you can compare that to modern feathers.
Well, yeah, this is just it. You can look at these ancient feathered dinosaurs and put them under an SEM, a high-powered microscope, and you can see those same melanosomes, and you can see their shapes, and by deduction, you can figure out what color.
That's remarkable.
Yeah.
And
so we'll never know for T-Rex and other non-feathered dinosaurs.
It doesn't work on non-feathered dinosaurs yet. Yeah.
But this was getting into another area that was fascinating to me, talking about what exactly you can get out of a mineralized specimen. I mean, you're talking histology, right? I mean, looking down at the cellular level, which I wouldn't think would have been preserved because cells are usually part of soft tissues that would have been dissolved away.
Yeah. Well, as I say, that you're right, but the original sort of physical structures remain the same. So the organelles have been replaced by mineral. Their shape remains, but the original organic structure no longer remains.
So that's at
soft tissue.
So that's at an organelle stage. Does it get down can you actually see at the cellular level ever? I mean, see individual cells?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, you can. Subcellular, well, organelles are subcellular, so you can get it subcellular.
That's
even.
subcellular in organelle.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, organelles are little structures within the cell. Yeah.
Oh, right, like a mitochondria or Golgi apparatus and things like that, right?
Yeah, those are all organelles.
Because I came across this other thing talking about the preservation of proteins in the geosphere, which I thought was kind of all related to this. Deep time protein preservation, attracting increasing interest and rapid research within the paleobiological community in recent years. But several different viewpoints, blah, blah, blah. And I'm just going, proteins are being preserved in deep time geologic structures? Blows my mind.
I mean, and that's a relative, and admittedly, this is starting to get beyond what I know much about, but that's something that paleontologists we're pushing back all the time. DNA and protein, and how far back can we pull this stuff out of the fossil record? And we're nowhere near being able to pull those types of proteins and whatnot out of dinosaur bones yet, but we're finding them in ancient rhinoceros and camels that are millions of years old now, and we wouldn't have fathomed this 50 years ago, certainly, and maybe not even 20 years ago. But the more we look, the more you look, the more you find.
Yeah.
And so this is, again, not something we would have even thought to look for, because our bias 50 years ago was that, no, those things can't possibly exist. But when I actually look, turns out that some of those original structures are there. And they've been sort of masked over via, permineralization and whatever. But when you dissolve away the mineral, sometimes you're left with a little bit of organic content behind.
That's mind-blowing, really.
And what about when an animal falls into something like the La Brea tar pit? Like, does that, or can that work like amber and insects, and suddenly, holy cow, I've got a...
Well, I wanted to talk about that too, the amber and the insects, because I'm sure I already know the answer to this, but I was curious if there's any chance in the blood and all that. There's Jurassic Park, zero chance, I'm guessing.
But
sorry to derail you.
That's okay. No, it all...
Put a pin in that,
It's kind of the same thing in a way, but I was just wondering with La Brea, when they brought out Smilodons or whatever that got stuck in those things, was the tar just like too... I mean, obviously there was some preservation that went on, but
it's mostly just the bones that are preserved at La Brea. Yeah.
I was stuck with just the bones. Jeez.
Yeah, I know. It's so frustrating.
It's frustrating, but it's also I find it interesting, because if you have all the answers, then it's no longer interesting anymore.
Yeah,
but the fun is in the mystery. Yeah.
Part of the fun of paleo is being able to fill in the gaps, I think, with your imagination. Here's what we know. Here's what could be. And it's an interesting marriage almost between science and fantasy paleontology that I find a lot of fun.
The ongoing mystery,
Yeah.
So no chance then. Because companies like Colossal are now purportedly bringing back the woolly mammoth, my favorite animal of all time, the Tasmanian tiger or the thylacine.
Yeah.
I think there's another one, the dodo bird they're talking about as well. So is there a world where we could get blood from a mosquito like Jurassic Park?
Well, the Jurassic Park scenario where, they're extracting blood at a mosquito and getting DNA and resurrecting dinosaurs, that's not likely to happen.
I would wonder if a mosquito could even pierce the hide of a dinosaur,
I'm sure they could maybe get in around the eyes or something where the skin's really thin.
Or it might have been giant mosquitoes back then. I don't know.
Well, go back far enough. Yeah, maybe. But there were small ones around the times of dinosaurs, just like today. And the problem with DNA is it's a very, very volatile molecule. Like that thing wants to, go to crap instantaneously, particularly in water. DNA dissolves in water. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, to preserve so many of these dinosaur fossils, you need a source of water for that sediment. A lot of these, as I say, dinosaurs are being preserved in these ancient river ecosystems or at the bottoms of lakes or what have you. And so the likelihood that the DNA would be preserved due to the water is very low. And of course you've got there's water and other fluids in the stomachs of these mosquitoes too. The stomachs are meant to dissolve these organic contents. So if a mosquito is going to drink the blood of a dinosaur, it's going to pretty quickly break that DNA up to the point that it's going to be useless to it, regardless of whether it gets preserved in amber or what have you. Yeah.
That's what I was wondering. Oh, well.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm still rooting for the thylacine to come back, so I'll be happy with that.
Like I said, sometimes we assume that that's the case, and we don't spend a lot of time looking for dinosaur DNA in mosquitoes based on that assumption, but who knows? Maybe I might be wrong about that one.
Yeah, here's where our imaginations come back into play. Yeah. Oh, man. Okay, well, I wanted to get into sexual dimorphism, which was another thing I had to look up, but was quick to understand, which is animals having differences between females and males, whether it's size, coloration, I'm sure many other things.
Yeah.
And you, in something that was published by Cambridge University, some of your work was published there, and you basically think that the data does not support this? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, so the idea of sexual dimorphism is as you said, it's a difference between males and females, and we're really familiar with the idea because humans are sexually dimorphic.
So many animals.
So many animals. Yeah. Think of the peacock and the peahen.
Of course, yeah.
And so there's been and it's probable that dinosaurs exhibited sexual dimorphism too. And it's been proposed over the years that probably they were. Typically what's happened is people have taken a small sample of a single dinosaur species. Maybe we have like half a dozen individuals, and they look at the animals and they say, well, these ones over here, this half over here is bigger skeletons, and this half over here are smaller skeletons. Therefore, the big ones are the males and the small ones are the females, or vice versa. It doesn't really matter. And but I mean, you can take any sample you want and divide it in half, and half will be bigger than average and half will be smaller than average.
Well, I was going to ask, how do they determine the sex even? Is that...
Well, it's really hard to do.
Yeah,
and traditionally we've had no idea. And
dino junk left over, right?
Not usually, yeah. And so I decided to revisit some of these old ideas about dinosaur dimorphism and do the stats on them and see, if we actually create histograms of these things, do we see two peaks like we would expect if they're dimorphic, meaning two morphs, right? Or do you only get one peak effectively? And I showed that for all these different species that we're calling dimorphic, there's only one peak in the histogram. So either they weren't dimorphic, so the males and females look the same, or we just don't have a good enough sample size. It's like anything in statistics. You want a big representative sample size. And when it comes to dinosaur fossils, very often we just don't have very good samples because dinosaurs are pretty rare and hard to come by, particularly good, complete skeletons.
So it could be true, but we just don't have the data to support it at this
Exactly,
current time.
Exactly. And, and so that study you're referring to, which was published in the journal Paleobiology, that I think is published by Cambridge University Press. They published that back in 2017, I think. And so some people have come along now and started pushing back, and I guess I spurred them on maybe a little bit.
That's good. Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, no, that's how science is supposed to work.
Exactly, yeah.
And so some people have come along since and said, oh, actually, okay, if we apply the methods that, Jordan recommends, then I think we are able to find dimorphism in this new population of dinosaurs that we have. There, I reviewed a paper out of France a few years ago, publishing on a population of these ornithomimid or ostrich mimic dinosaurs. And they argued, I thought, fairly convincingly that they see dimorphism in the shape and size, I think it was of the humerus or maybe one of the limb bones, something like that. And so...
Or I was wondering with feathered dinosaurs if they could see something similar, like in the plumage, like a peacock
It's been argued, yeah. We don't have... The feathers are tricky because they're always preserved sort of as these Chinese feathered dinosaurs are always preserved as pancakes. And so it's hard to get an idea of what exactly the plumage was like beyond. Yeah. We don't know the colors very often, as I say. You got to look really carefully for that. And we only know of the colors for a few species, but there's still a lot unknown, and particularly when it comes to the feathers. There's a bird called Confucius ornis, one of these early birds, and it's been suggested that some of the males probably had long tail plumes that came off, long feathers that came off the end, because it seems like half of them have these tail plumes and half of them don't. That could be true. It could also be true that the tails that don't have those plumes, those feathers just fell out or were molted or something like that, but there could be something to it. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting nonetheless.
The point of that study was just show it's really hard to know. And so we shouldn't be randomly divvying up our samples in half and saying, okay, the big ones are the males and the small ones are the females, because you really don't. You can recover that sample you can recover that pattern, that signal, whether there's dimorphism there or not.
Yeah. It doesn't seem very conclusive at all, no.
No.
Okay, well, as I said, I didn't get time to transfer all my notes, but I did want to go into a lot of your work is late Cretaceous, leading to the mass extinction event, which took out the dinosaurs. So I've got a lot of questions around that. Specifically, well, let's start off with it's for sure that it was an asteroid or meteor at this point, because that's another thing that as a child I thought it was more of a theory that's been, validated since then.
Yeah, I mean, it's still a theory. Technically, but we've got a lot of good evidence.
I was going to say, I thought they had an impact zone in the Gulf of Mexico.
We do, yeah. Okay. We have the impact crater that dates to the extinction of the dinosaurs 66 million years ago.
That's a smoking gun, if you ask me.
Exactly, it's a smoking gun, and so there's really not a lot of debate as to whether it was the meteor or not. It might have been the meteor and yada, 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 volcanism and the Deccan traps or something like that over in India. There's still some debate about that, whether it was just the meteor or maybe there were other influences too that created a sort of perfect storm of dinosaur extinction.
Yeah, because a meteor could create, obviously, tidal waves, but I thought it could also set off earthquakes and volcanoes and things like that.
All the above.
Yeah, if that's all happening at the same time, it's not going to be good.
You're introducing, all this ash and rock debris into the atmosphere, which is blocking out the sun, which is shutting down
sort of
photosynthesis.
like a nuclear winter almost.
Exactly. Yeah, that would have lasted decades, years and years.
Okay,
if that was true, it's little wonder dinosaurs are extinct.
Follow up then, because something and I'm sure many people watching this are curious about is, I did find out that the order of Crocodilia seemed to emerge in the late Cretaceous. So how did these guys, and correct me if that's wrong, but how did these crocodiles survive to be very similar to modern day crocodiles when all the dinosaurs went kaput,
Yeah, well, crocodiles they've been around longer than the Cretaceous, but the general point is right that they lived alongside the dinosaurs.
Okay.
As did birds and frogs and turtles and on all these groups are still with us today.
Yeah, so what was I guess
it's a hard question.
Nothing to eat, maybe, if the plant life was dying from lack of sun?
Generally what we see is at the extinction of the dinosaurs, all the big dinosaurs get wiped out, all the big animals do, and generally the small ones remain. And that goes for the mammals and
which almost lends itself to what we were talking about earlier, that the big dinosaurs probably did need to eat a lot, and now all of a sudden they maybe weren't able to.
Yeah. So one idea that was proposed recently is, well, maybe the birds eked through because although all the plants died, what was left behind were their seeds that were scattered on the ground after they died. So maybe some of those small birds were able to eke through the extinction because they could survive on the seeds after the fact that are still laying around. They can
traverse much greater distances, I would imagine, with flight to be able to find more food sources than someone who has to hoof it.
Yeah, and if you're a small-bodied animal, there are more places for you to hide, and take refuge in. You can burrow in the ground and find safety there from, the giant tidal wave that's coming or what have you. So
yeah, well, the smaller ones doesn't really surprise me as much as something like a crocodile, which may have been even larger back then. I'm not sure.
Some yes, some no. Yeah. And crocs were devastated. We don't have the same diversity of crocs around that we used to back then. So there absolutely were some lineages of crocs that went extinct, and yet they remain. And there's probably some advantage to living in an aquatic environment too, because you're sort of buffered from a lot of what's going on the surface, right? So a lot of marine animals made it through, but then again, many of those were devastated too. Ammonites, which are these ancient shelly animals related to things like squid and octopus, those went extinct too. The mosasaurs went extinct. The marine reptiles, plesiosaurs, ichthyosaurs were gone, I think, before the end of the Cretaceous. But it was devastating both on land and in the water. And we don't have just a simple, there's probably not a simple single answer that accounts for the extinction of all of them. They all probably went extinct for subtly different reasons that may all have a common cause, but that cause, of course, has rippling effects in all different directions that will, disfavor or disadvantage some groups that ultimately went extinct.
Wow. I knew I was going to keep having my mind blown. And do you have anything I should ask if you want to interject with the extinction event?
No, not on the extinction event, but I do have another question when you're ready.
Bring it on.
Yeah, I mean, we already touched on the bird dinosaur thing. I read about synapsids and proto-mammals, which I found pretty interesting, but...
I don't work on those.
Okay, yeah.
They are
it's
interesting.
not your wheelhouse. That's fine. So yeah, go ahead, of course.
So I just wanted to know generally, I mean, when you're working from the fossil record and you're trying to, theorize about how these animals lived or how they interacted and things like that, I know there are other things like dinosaur tracks that can tell you something maybe about the gait of an animal, and then you can start going, well, if they were this far apart, it was capable of running,
or bipedal versus
things like that.
Yeah,
and then there's the other aspects of the fossil record, as much as you can get, I guess, which is about the ecology in the area. The types of plants that might have been alive at the time and all that sort of stuff. And so these sort of ancillary explorations, as opposed to just dealing with the bones, how big a part of paleontology is that? And is it a growing area as they try to get past the sort of limitations of bones? Or is it, no, it's static, it's always been there, and we continue to use that? I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's a big part. Yeah, certainly dinosaur trackways, they're a super important source of information, and they're surprisingly abundant because, of course, an animal, when it dies, it only leaves one skeleton, but over the course of its lifetime, a single individual can leave many, many, many trackways. So trackways are really abundant. And as you say, they're an important source of information that tells us things like, did dinosaurs travel in herds or groups, and leave a series of parallel trackways to one another? Or how fast were they able to run? The farther apart your footprints are, generally speaking, the faster the animal was moving. So we can study things like their pace and their stride to get some idea about the speed at which dinosaurs were moving. So we pull all those different sources of data together to try and come up with some ideas of how dinosaurs lived. But trackways are problematic too, because you don't always know what animal made them. You can tell, well, this is a biped and this is a quadruped, and maybe the toes are really thick. They have thick, deep impressions of the toes, and they're splayed far apart. So generally that seems to be what herbivorous dinosaurs did. But beyond that, it's really hard to say, well, this species made this trackway. And very often where you find rock strata, layers in the rock that preserve dinosaur skeletons, for whatever reason, don't often do a good job of preserving footprints. And those layers that do preserve footprints, often we don't find the dinosaur bones in. So it can be quite frustrating that way. So there's still a lot of unknowns, but we draw upon the footprint record all the time. I actually have a student who's defending his thesis on Friday, doing a project that relates to dinosaur tracks and how can we relate the trackways to the shapes of dinosaur feet. Is there a correlation there that he's been looking into? So hopefully something good comes of that. Jack Davidson, I'll give him a shout. Good luck, Jack.
Shout out to Jack. Yeah, that's awesome. This Friday, wow.
Yeah.
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't touch on cryptozoology, especially with you mentioning the plesiosaur. That's how you say it?
Plesiosaur.
Plesiosaur,
Yeah.
okay. Because everyone knows Loch Ness Monster, Nessie. I also remember as a child hearing about an African legend called the Mokalemembe. I don't know if you've ever heard. There's
Yeah,
like a, basically a
Mokele
brontosaur-
Mbembe or
that's how
something
you say
like
it.
that,
A
yeah.
brontosaurus or something. And a lot of people have said that's, likely very much a falsehood. And it was propagated, again, I think, by ministers and New Age sort of, or New Earth, rather. People,
Yeah, young
proponents
Earth
of that.
creationists
Yeah.
like that idea. Certainly, yeah.
But other people say it's a spirit or something, so I'm not really touching on that. But Nessie, again, I don't really think it's there. I'd love to believe it as a child, but then we have something like the coelacanth, that fish that people thought was extinct for millions of years, and then all of a sudden they find one in 1938.
Something like that, yeah.
So do you think there's any chance that there are other prehistoric creatures still at large, especially in the oceans?
Oh, who knows? At the bottom of the depths of the ocean, I'm sure there is. We know for a fact.
We just
there's all
interviewed a
kinds
sperm
of
whale
life.
expert, so it's on my mind.
Oh, yeah. There's all kinds of life down there that we know very little about, maybe nothing about in many cases. We're finding new species down there almost every time we look. They're usually quite small things, but
Yeah.
it's possible that there are other ancient relics down there. I couldn't name you one. I really doubt whether there's any plesiosaurs or mosasaurs hiding out down there. I think at this point we'd probably find one washed up on a beach somewhere.
Yeah, that's fair.
And when we talk about Nessie, of course, we've been spotting Nessie for a long time. And
For the audio listeners, he just did
the
quotes.
scare quotes, yeah. and it's always presumed to be the same animal, like it's Nessie, the individual plesiosaur that lives at Loch Ness. But it would, in order for that animal to survive, it would need to be part of a community. Like, for the legend to live, there needs to be a viable breeding population of these things.
Well, do we know what the age expectancy would have been on an animal like that?
A plesiosaur?
Could they live hundreds of years potentially, like a Greenland shark? Or?
I doubt they lived that long. I don't know what the longevity is of a plesiosaur is. I don't know that anyone's done that research. Certainly for the dinosaurs, they don't appear to have lived longer than a few decades, maybe.
Okay.
Many of them, anyways. Maybe the big neck sauropods, not beyond 100, certainly.
Because you have tortoises that live in a few hundred years.
Yeah,
that's why my mind
dinosaurs
went there.
appear to have lived fairly short and fast lives. They lived fast and died young.
Rock and roll lifestyle.
Yeah, Tyrannosaurs especially. But getting back to Nessie, it's you need to have a viable population in order to account for that, long-lived legend, and yet, if there were a population of these things in Loch Ness, we would know it. We'd be seeing them all the time, and yet we don't.
This is what I wondered, because the argument for Nessie was that it was, I believe that the Loch Ness is there's a seaway, it connects somehow to the ocean.
I believe so.
So
yeah.
I think that people sort of posited that one of them got trapped in the loch. And let's say that happened back whenever the first reports, 1900 or whenever they started coming out. Could it not be that reports are just being perpetuated by original actual accounts that did happen, and then that one did die, but now people continue to claim it just based on superstition?
Is it possible? Sure. Do we have evidence for that?
I'm really hoping that Nessie's out there.
Well, you're not alone. Like, I hope we do too. That would be so cool. Like, my dream would be to see a real dinosaur.
Plesiosaur,
Yeah. A sauropod. And
wait, they're not dinosaurs, you told me though, right?
Plesiosaurs are not dinosaurs.
Okay, I'm just checking in.
I'd still like to see plesiosaur too, sure.
5 points for listening.
But just the likelihood that we would ever find something like that is so ridiculously small. Especially everyone's got a camera in their pocket. Yeah. So we should be seeing these things all over the place.
Damn smartphones have really taken the magic out of a lot of mysteries. You Bigfoot too,
Oh yeah. As I say, sometimes a little mystery is nice, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Sometimes it's nice not to know everything.
I did want to ask you about skull fenestration, because this is another thing I had no idea about, which is a variety of holes in the skull. It looks like circular, generally speaking, or ovoid. And I'm wondering what the purpose of these was. Because humans, we just have the two big ones in the eye sockets mainly, right?
Well, there are different purposes for fenestre, or technically that's window. Think of French fenêtre, right?
Oh,
the same root word.
Because some of these skulls
window.
it's seemingly a lot of them, like way more.
Some have more, and some don't. And we used to classify different reptile groups based on how many holes they had in the skulls. The anapsids and the diapsids and the archosaurs. Archosaurs have highly fenestrated skulls, birds and crocs and dinosaurs.
What do they theorize was the reason for this?
Well, some of the holes in the skull, as you mentioned, are for the eyes. And some of the holes are for the nose. Some of the holes are they allowed the temporal muscles, the jaw closing muscles to pass through them. And some of the holes were probably like to help lighten up the skull, because especially in big animals, if you're a big animal with a skull that's made of solid bone, it's going to be heavy, and you want to lose bone where you don't need it. So like a good example is the horned dinosaurs that I work on a lot. Things like Triceratops and their kin. Although Triceratops had a big frill, and somewhat surprisingly, it didn't have any holes that developed in the frill. It's like the only example that didn't do that. But all the other horned dinosaurs have these holes in the frill. We call them the parietal fenestrae. And we don't really know why they were there, what they did. They don't seem to have supported muscles of any kind. There were no eyes in those holes, but we think probably they developed as the animal got bigger, the fenestrae opened up to lighten up the frill, so it wasn't so damn heavy to carry around all the time.
Getting neck aches and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So sometimes, those holes just develop where you can afford to lose bone, because if bone is metabolically expensive. Bone is a living tissue. You've got to supply it with blood so it can grow and stay alive and whatnot and respond to stress and strain. But if the bone is useless and isn't serving a structural purpose, animals will very often resorb that bone or lose it because there's energy savings to be had, so to speak. So
this is happening over millions of years, I would imagine.
Oh yeah, okay. Certainly, yeah. Huh. So yeah, there's different reasons why you might open holes up in the skull, and one of those reasons we think is just energy savings and mechanical or structural efficiency, really.
Wow. Yeah, I never would have guessed that was the reason. I'm glad you touched back on horned dinosaurs though, because I wanted to ask you. Some of the stuff I'd read said that they were some of the most successful dinosaurs at the time that they were alive?
One of them, yeah. So the horned dinosaurs really sort of came into their own at the end of the Cretaceous period, in the last 10 to 20 million years of the age of the dinosaurs. And when they were around, they made up, I wouldn't say the bulk of dinosaur ecosystems, the majority of dinosaur ecosystems. That probably goes to the duck-billed dinosaurs, but maybe second to the duck-bills, depending on exactly where and when you're talking about, were the horned dinosaurs, which are just so much cooler looking anyway.
Yeah. Did they use these horns primarily for combat or hunting, or was it something that was more for show and attracting a mate?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we're still sort of debating that. And if I can give the short answer first, maybe it's probably all of the above. It's pretty rare in the animal kingdom that a single feature has a single function. Think of our hands. We can use our hands for so many different things. We can use it to feed ourselves and to get dressed and to throw a baseball. But
we lost the tail.
We lost the tail. Didn't need it, so you lose it. Again,
that's
efficiency.
Fair, yeah.
So probably these horns were likely used for defense. They were probably used for display of some kind. They were probably used for jousting. A colleague of mine, Andy Farkey, he's a good friend, did some cool work where he took two skull models of Triceratops and he locked their horns together, like you might see, I don't know, wrestling deer do today.
I was going to say elk or something, yeah.
Something like that. And he looked to see where on the skulls do the tips of those horns, touch the skull. Where do they interlock? Where are the tips of the horns likely to do damage if these animals actually locked their skulls together? Then he went back to the fossil record and looked in those areas on the fossils to see if he could find pathological lesions on the bones where we might predict. And sure enough, he found them there. They're concentrated there versus other parts of the skull. So we took that as pretty good evidence that Triceratops probably locked horns together.
Some sparring was going on.
They were doing sparring of some kind. Yeah, whether it be the males that were doing that or the females that were doing that, we don't really know. If I had to guess, I'd say the males, but
You brought up like elk and caribou and all these other types that do what we were talking about. Would the horns of these dinosaurs be similar in that they would fall out during certain seasons and regrow, or would this be a permanent thing like a rhinoceros?
yeah, more like a rhino, but a rhinoceros horn is purely made of keratin. There's no bony core inside. If you lop a rhino horn off, there's like basically a little stump at the bottom of bone. But a horn dinosaur horn had a bony horn core on the inside that was covered by a keratinous sheath. Think of something like the horns of a bovid, like a bull or something like that. They've got a bony horn core on the inside, and then those horns are covered by a keratinous sheath. That's pretty analogous to
It's really connected to the
ceratopsian
skull.
horn. Yeah, exactly. And of course, we don't have the keratin, that keratinous sheath, when we find one of these animals. We just have the bony horn core that remains.
Interesting. So if they had strictly keratin horns, we might not even know that they had horns, other than maybe an area.
Yeah. You might guess it from some of the bony features around, but you wouldn't necessarily know it. Yeah, you're right about that. Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I think I've gone through most of the stuff I was going to ask you.
Well, our conversation here segues into something I have for you.
Oh, okay.
You asked me to.
You're too kind.
You asked me to bring something for the studio, and I did.
Yeah, you told me you had something. I've been excited ever since.
And it's a horned dinosaur skull.
Nice.
A 3D print of one of our horned dinosaur skulls.
Awesome.
So that's
going to sit right here
on your table. Or
oh yeah, put it in the middle. That's awesome.
So this animal is actually this is an animal that I named back in 2016 called Spiclipius.
Oh, I thought it was spicy lips.
Spicy lips.
I've got it here though, and you also discovered a turtle or named a turtle and
named a turtle. Yeah.
Basilinus
morinensis from the town of Morin. Yeah,
and then a mosasaur as well.
Yeah, one of these marine reptiles. Yeah, most recently with a colleague of mine, Tetsudo Miyashita at the museum, we named a new species of one of these ankylosaurs together too. This was back in February, just like a month or two ago. Yeah. But this is Spiclipius shiporum from...
So how big would this have gotten?
Oh, rhino size.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess these guys didn't come in the
2
small
tons.
variety unless they were like juveniles.
Bingo, yeah.
Okay.
Well, you get smaller... I shouldn't say that. There are smaller horned dinosaurs, but the family... of horned dinosaurs with the big horns over the eyes and the horn over the nose and the big shield. These are called the ceratopsids. Those were all generally 1+ tons. Yeah. Triceratops is like 10 tons.
The Styracosaur actually has a juggle horn on its cheeks.
Yeah, jugal horn.
Jugal,
yeah,
there you go.
yeah.
I knew I was going to pronounce something wrong.
Most of those horned dinosaurs had horns on their cheeks too. Does this show it? I don't know if, what I'm pointing to right here on the cheek. That's the jugal horn right there. Yeah.
So that would have helped with the argument that dinosaurs had cheeks if they had horns coming out of them, I would think.
Well, they're the bony cheeks, but the fleshy cheeks we're talking about, I'll explain it to the audience that's not watching on YouTube, is between the jaws here, around where the jaws are. So if this animal opened its mouth, the idea is that there'd be a fleshy area covering the teeth, to keep the food in. And so the jugal horn is back and behind the teeth. It's kind of the bony part of the cheek. We have jugal bones as well. Imagine if we had bones coming out of our cheeks, but that's closer to the brow than it is to our teeth.
No, I see what you're saying now.
Yeah,
this thing is so cool. Oh my God. Well, thank you so much for bringing that.
Of course, yeah. That was, as I said, that was 3D printed. We just ran it off this week. My research assistant, Shang, at work did that. He's a genius at that stuff. So I said, let's run one off quick for
give him my thanks. I really do appreciate this. Yeah, that's beyond cool. I wanted to ask one thing that I thought of today when I went to the museum, which is not really related to dinosaurs, but you have spent a large amount of time there, I would imagine. Is the top floor actually haunted? Because this is something we always heard when we were kids on field trips there. Somebody killed himself, or is there any truth to that, or is it just like a real urban legend kind of thing?
If it's true, I don't know it.
You're not privy to that information.
Well, I've heard it said that the ghost that haunts the top floor is the ghost of Lawrence Lambe.
Oh, really? I heard it was a janitor or something.
Well,
that's kids talking on the schoolyard. Yeah.
I know you had Glenn Humplick on the show.
Yeah.
And Glenn, of course, was on the Tom Green show. Tom Green tried to shoot a segment apparently. So I'm told this is kind of lore coming to me. Tried to shoot a segment on the top floor of the museum back when he had his Rogers 22 show here, and apparently he was caught. The idea was he was going to film up there, like stay overnight, kind of sneak, hang out overnight, kind of night at the museum kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then try and film the ghost. And I guess security caught him and kicked him out. And I'm told, I don't know if it's real or not, but I'm told, maybe Glenn knows.
We can ask him.
That Tom was kicked out of the museum for life. I don't know how true that is.
I feel like they'd welcome him back now with his celebrity status.
I would welcome him back. I will risk annoying my bosses and say Tom's welcome back to the museum.
There you go. If we can get that message to Tom that he's got a chaperoned, experience the next time he goes.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I've also wanted to know if you had a favorite dinosaur. Kind of a straightforward. question.
I'm always asked that question, and it always changes. Growing up, it was T-Rex, like every other kid. Is it still T-Rex? Probably not.
That's so cliche, right?
It's cliched, yeah. I
Allosaur or
grew
something.
to love, as an undergraduate student at Carleton University, I grew to love the horned dinosaurs because that was the first sort of group that I was given to work on. So I sort of cut my teeth on them. So horned dinosaurs, probably Chasmosaurus, which is one of these horned dinosaurs. I love Spiclibius too, which sits before us. That was the first dinosaur that I got to name, and so it's special to me for that reason.
Yeah.
And it just looks so badass.
Really, all the horned dinosaurs, like you were saying, they really are the most sort of menacing, hardcore looking, like they would not take any slack.
Well, some are boring looking, but I won't insult my friends who work on them. So,
oh, sorry, yeah, just so the audience can get a good look at it. But we can put a picture of it up and sort of superimpose.
You can't see it well against the yellow.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe.
I knew we should have printed it in black.
No, I'll take some pictures of it. I'll superimpose it over our image here. God, I know I'm going to forget something. I don't. Oh, we do have a season 5 question. I guess we'll just get to that at this point. Maybe we'll have you back someday.
Okay.
Oh, actually, before we do, I did want to point out, you were talking about Tom Green in the museum. If you've never seen it, or if anyone's never seen it, when he went to the art museum is one of the funniest Tom Green clips to me, because he made a very simple painting, abstract. It was like 2 black lines and a red line or something like that, called Zebra Tiger or something. And he actually managed to put it up on the wall with a fake little plaque that made it look like it was an actual exhibit. And at one point, he has an elderly woman, I believe, who's there just taken in the museum, and he's right next to her, and she's looking at it, and he takes out like a Sharpie and starts drawing like a little person, and she's just flabbergasted. Anyways, go check that out. But
what I liked about the Tom Green show back in the day, when back before he became big, he could just do the simplest things. They didn't have to be these big, elaborate, complicated sketches. He could just keep it simple and elicit a reaction. This is before he started humping mooses and stuff like that. Yeah.
Oh, man. Okay, well, season 5 question we've asked everyone so far this season, which is if you could revisit a memory from your life at any time in all its vivid detail, what would it be and why? And we sort of veto the birth of your child and the go-to example, something more specific.
Revisit a memory, as in, could I go back to that time?
So you can't change anything,
Okay,
but
okay.
effectively, yeah, you could be there again, experience all the smells and touches and whatever it may
damn.
be.
Okay.
But you can't alter the course of history by
Okay, because I would if I could.
oh yeah, what would you change? Now I'm curious about that.
Oh, well, it's dark. My sister passed away.
Oh my God, I'm
Yeah.
so sorry to hear that.
Oh, well, this was long ago now, but she was diabetic and she had a bad diabetic reaction. I would have said, I would go back and tell her to eat an apple before she went to bed.
Oh my God, that's heartbreaking.
But let's keep it light.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to unearth that, but
Oh, no, it's okay. It's okay.
no, it's good to vent as well.
If I could revisit and not change the course of history, what would I do?
Even just a memory you love that you would just love to re-experience
Well,
again.
you know what? It's hard to pick because I'm really nostalgic, which is partly why I like your basement here. Maybe. Well, I mentioned before seeing Jurassic Park when I was 11, and that stuck with me. So maybe going back, you never experience a movie the same way after.
You want to see it with fresh eyes again.
Yeah, to be able to see it with fresh eyes again and sort of relive the magic of the time. Because at this point, it's pretty old hat.
Well, and Jurassic World does not compare.
They're let's
garbage.
not go there.
Yeah, I mean, even some of the Jurassic Park sequels weren't exquisite. I can't remember them well.
None
now,
of them
but
are as good as the first, of course.
one of them has Vincent D'Onofrio in it, really young though. I think it's the second one, unless I'm
You're
getting
thinking
some,
of Vince Vaughn?
Vince Vaughn, maybe. Yeah.
He was in the second one, which again paled in comparison to the first. So to go back and revisit, see that first one as an 11-year-old, and go home and tell my mom I want to be a paleontologist, that'd be pretty cool to relive that again.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it was a real pivotal point in your life.
It was a moment. Yeah, it was a moment among moments, but it was an important one. Yeah.
Well, this has been an absolute blast, and I'll talk about dinosaurs with you anytime that you're available. Thank
Glad
you
to come
again for
back.
bringing this. Oh, dear. I don't know where that came from.
I wonder if there's dinosaur blood.
Yeah, looks like a fruit fly. Weird. Okay, I guess spring is here. Anyways, thanks again so much. We high five at the end.
Thanks for having me, Oliver.
Yeah,
That was a good one.
It was so much fun, man.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye.